I was 51 years old the night a quiet handyman took my hand at the front door and made the entire careful world I had built around my loneliness begin to tremble. He was the last person I ever expected to see me, the man from 2 blocks down who fixed roofs and rarely spoke more than necessary. After the storm passed and the house settled back into its usual silence, he turned to me with those steady eyes and said something so ordinary it should have meant nothing at all. Yet my body shook as if I had been asleep for a decade and someone had finally whispered my name into the dark. To understand why that single, simple moment undid me so completely, I have to take you back to the ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the rain started falling and my roof began to leak in ways I could no longer ignore. If you've ever been surprised by the way your own heart can still betray you at an age when you thought it was finished, stay right here with me. Hit like if this feels familiar, subscribe for the rest of the story, and drop a comment below telling me the moment you realized you weren't as invisible as you believed. It began with rain that wouldn't stop. I had been a widow for 3 years by then, and most days the silence in the house felt almost normal. I would wake at 6:30, make tea in the chipped blue mug that had belonged to my mother, and sit at the kitchen table watching the light change on the garden my husband had planted before he died. The roses still bloomed, though no one but me ever stopped to smell them. My daughter Sarah lived 2 states away with her husband and 2 small children. She called once a week, always polite, always in a hurry, and visited maybe twice a year. I worked part-time at the town library, shelving books and helping old men find large print mysteries. In the evenings, I read or watched the news with the volume low so the ticking clock wouldn't sound so loud. I kept the house clean, the bills paid, the garden weeded. I told myself that was enough. Most days I almost believed it. But that Tuesday the sky opened up and refused to close. By mid-afternoon, water was dripping steadily from the kitchen ceiling into the sink, right onto the blue mug I had left there to dry. I stood watching it for a long time, the steady plink-plink like a clock counting down something I couldn't name. The roof had been fine for years. My husband used to say he would get to the flashing one of these weekends. He never did. Now the water was finding every weak spot, and I had no one to call who would understand what it meant to watch your home slowly come apart while you stood there alone. I found the number for Miller's handyman service in the back of the phone book, the same place I had found the plumber 3 years earlier when the toilet ran all night. The woman who answered sounded tired. She said Frank could come that same afternoon if I didn't mind waiting. I didn't mind. Waiting was something I had grown good at. He pulled up just after 3 in an old blue truck with rust along the wheel wells. I watched from the living room window as he climbed out, tall, broad through the shoulders, a graying beard that looked like it had been trimmed with kitchen scissors, flannel shirt faded to the color of old leaves, work boots that had seen better decades. He didn't look at the house like most men did, with that quick once-over that said they were already calculating the bill. He looked at it the way you look at something that has been standing a long time and deserves respect. I opened the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than I expected, almost gentle. "It's just Elena," I said. "Come in. The leak's in the kitchen." He wiped his boots on the mat like it mattered, stepped inside, and followed me without another word. In the kitchen, he stood for a long moment looking up at the wet spot on the ceiling, then at the water still dripping into the sink. He touched the blue mug with one finger, turning it slightly as if checking for damage. "This been going on long?" he asked. "Started this morning. I think it's worse now." He nodded, set his toolbox on the floor, and went outside without asking permission. I heard the ladder creak, then the sound of his boots on the roof. Rain was still falling, but lighter now, the kind that soaks everything slowly. I made coffee even though he hadn't asked for it, and when he came back inside 20 minutes later, his flannel was dark with wet, and his beard had tiny beads of water caught in it. "Fascia's rotted," he said, accepting the mug I offered. "Flashing's shot too. I can patch it enough to get you through the night, but the real fix will take a couple days in better weather. You want me to do what I can today?" I nodded. He drank the coffee black, no sugar, the same way my husband used to. I noticed that and then tried not to notice it. He worked steadily, moving the ladder, cutting new pieces, the sound of his hammer muffled by the rain. Every so often I brought him a towel or a fresh cup. He never said much, just "thank you" and This should hold till morning. By 6 o'clock, the light was fading and the rain had stopped, but the patch was only temporary. Water still found its way in if you looked closely. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, wiping his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Should be dry enough by then to do it right." I looked at the clock. It was nearly 7. He had been here almost 4 hours. "You must be hungry," I heard myself say. "I have chicken soup on the stove. It's nothing fancy, but there's plenty." He studied me for a second, the way people do when they're deciding whether kindness is real or just politeness. Then he nodded once. "If it's no trouble." We ate at the kitchen table under the single lamp. The soup was simple: carrots, celery, leftover chicken from Sunday, but it tasted better than anything I had made in months. He ate slowly, like a man who had learned to make food last. After a while, the silence between us stopped feeling awkward and started feeling like something else, something I couldn't name yet. "Your husband built this place?" he asked, nodding toward the old oak beams in the ceiling. "Most of it. We finished the kitchen together the year Sarah turned 10. He smiled, small and private. "My wife always said kitchens were the heart of a house." She was right, I think. I waited for the usual clumsy condolences, but none came. Instead, he told me, quietly, that his wife had died 4 years ago after a long illness. His son lived in the city now and called on birthdays. The house he lived in was too big for one man, but he couldn't bring himself to sell it. I found myself telling him about the heart attack that took my husband in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, how the paramedics had to move the coffee table to get the stretcher through, how the house had felt like it stopped breathing the day they carried him out. We didn't talk about grief like people usually do, with big words and careful sympathy. We just let the facts sit between us like two people who already knew the weight of them. When the bowls were empty, he stood, carried both to the sink, and washed them without being asked. I watched his broad back at the counter, the way his hands moved carefully over the dishes like they were something fragile. No one had washed dishes in my kitchen since my husband died. The sound of running water and clinking porcelain filled the room, and for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. He dried his hands on the towel I handed him and turned to go. At the front door, he paused, one hand on the knob. The evening air was cool and smelled of wet earth and roses. He looked back at me, and for the first time I noticed the color of his eyes, gray like the sky after rain, steady and unafraid. "The roof will hold," he said, "but if the silence ever gets louder than you can stand, I'm just down the road. No charge for company." Then he reached out and took my hand in his. His skin was rough from years of work, warm from the dishwater, and he squeezed once, gentle, deliberate, nothing more. The touch lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it traveled straight through me like electricity. My fingers trembled under his, my breath caught. When he let go, I had to grip the doorframe to keep from swaying. He nodded once, the same quiet nod he had given me when he arrived, and walked down the path to his truck. I stood there long after the taillights disappeared around the corner, my hand still warm, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The street was empty, the house behind me was silent again, but something had changed in the space between the door and the road, something I couldn't put back the way it was. I closed the door slowly, leaned my forehead against the cool wood, and tried to steady my breathing. 51 years old, and my body was reacting like I was 20 again. It was ridiculous. It was terrifying. It was the first time in 3 years that I had felt anything at all besides the steady, manageable ache of being alone. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept walking through the rooms, touching the places he had fixed, replaying the sound of his voice and the weight of his hand. The blue mug sat on the counter where he had left it, still faintly warm from the coffee. I washed it twice before I finally put it away. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing, just kindness from a man who understood what empty houses felt like. But when I looked out the window and saw his truck pulling up the driveway again, my pulse stumbled the same way it had the night before. I touched my hair in the hallway mirror, something I hadn't done in years, and felt a small, ridiculous flutter of nerves. He knocked once. I opened the door. The sun was out now, the air fresh and clean after the storm. Frank stood there with his toolbox in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. "Brought you some fresh eggs," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My chickens get bored if I don't collect them every day. I took the bag, our fingers brushing for the briefest second. The same rough warmth, the same quiet steadiness in his eyes. "Come in," I said. "I'll make coffee." And just like that, the ordinary morning turned into something else, something I didn't have words for yet, but could already feel changing the shape of everything I thought I knew about the rest of my life. The morning after he came back with the eggs, I told myself it was just neighborly kindness, nothing more. I made coffee while he worked on the roof, the sound of his hammer steady and sure above my head. When he came down for a break, I handed him the mug, the same blue one, and watched the way his fingers wrapped around it like they belonged there. We didn't talk much. He ate one of the eggs I had scrambled with the last of the bacon, and when he left, he tipped his head toward the garden and said the roses looked like they could use a little mulch. I nodded. Later that afternoon, I found a bag of mulch leaning against the back gate. No note, just the bag sitting there like it had always been part of the yard. I couldn't stop thinking about his hand, not the way a schoolgirl thinks about a boy, but the way a woman who has been alone too long remembers what it feels like to be touched without pity or obligation. The memory sat under my skin like a small, warm stone. At the post office 2 days later, I saw him sorting mail at the counter. He looked up, gave me that same quiet nod, and went back to his letters. I felt a ridiculous flutter in my chest and hated myself for it. 51 years old, and I was acting like the world had just handed me a secret. On Thursday, I baked bread, honey wheat, the kind that takes all afternoon and fills the house with a smell that makes you remember Sunday mornings from years ago. I wrapped 2 loaves in a clean towel and walked the 2 blocks to his house before I could talk myself out of it. His place was smaller than mine, neat but lived in, with a vegetable garden along the side and a small chicken coop in the back. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, then pleased in that understated way of his. "Thought you might like something fresh," I said, holding out the bread. He took the bundle carefully, as if it was something breakable. "Come in," he said. "I'll put the kettle on." Inside, the house smelled of sawdust and lemon oil. He led me to a small table by the window where a row of wooden birds sat on a shelf, tiny wrens and robins and one little owl with its wings half spread. He picked up the wren and placed it in my palm. The wood was smooth from sanding, warm from his hand. Our fingers brushed for a second longer than necessary. I felt that same low tremor start in my chest again. "I carve them when the evenings get too quiet," he said. "Keeps the hands busy." I turned the little bird over, tracing the tiny feathers he had etched with such care. "They're beautiful." We sat with our coffee and talked about ordinary things, how the tomatoes were coming in early this year, how the library had just gotten a new shipment of large print books that the old men were already fighting over. He told me his wife used to read to him at night when his eyes got tired from work. I told him my husband used to fall asleep halfway through every chapter and then swear he had heard the ending in his dreams. We laughed, soft and careful, like people who had forgotten how. Before I left, he walked me to the gate. "If you ever need another pair of hands in that garden," he said, "I'm not doing much on weekends." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Walking home, I kept the little wooden wren in my pocket, my thumb rubbing the smooth back of it like a worry stone. That night, I placed it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, right next to the blue mug. It looked like it had always belonged there. The small gestures started happening without either of us naming them. One morning, I came out to find my mailbox straightened and the post leaning true again. I never asked. 2 days later, I noticed a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt when he reached for a tool. That evening, I mended it with careful stitches and left it folded on his porch with a note that simply said, "Thank you for the mulch." The next morning, the shirt was gone and a small bunch of fresh-picked lettuce sat in its place. We began meeting on the bench by the duck pond on Thursday evenings, the one under the big oak where the geese liked to gather. We talked about our children, his son who called on birthdays and sent awkward cards at Christmas, my daughter who measured every visit in hours and always seemed to be checking her watch. He never pushed, he just listened, the way people listen when they already understand the weight of the words. One evening, I wore lipstick for the first time in 3 years, soft rose, the kind that doesn't shout. I caught him looking at my mouth once when I laughed, and the look was so brief and so respectful I almost missed it. But I felt it. That night I lay awake wondering if I was being foolish, if a woman my age had any business feeling this small, secret warmth in her chest. The revelation came on a rainy Saturday when we were both at the library. I was shelving returns and he was looking for a book on woodworking. He paused beside me, ran his finger along the spine of a volume about old houses, and said quietly, "I used to see you here years ago. My wife loved the way you helped her find the right mysteries. She said you had kind eyes." He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept his gaze on the shelf. I always thought she was right. I stood there with a stack of books in my arms, the words settling over me like warm rain. He had known me, not as the widow in the big house, but as the woman behind the desk who smiled at his wife. The knowledge changed something. It made the connection feel less sudden and more like something that had been waiting quietly in the background for years. By the third week, the hunger had grown teeth. I caught myself glancing at the road every time a truck passed. I started leaving the porch light on longer in the evenings, just in case. The blue mug and the wooden wren sat side by side on the windowsill, like two small witnesses. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the hallway, touching the faint lines around my eyes and wondering if he saw them too, or if he saw something else entirely. Then, on a Wednesday evening, while I was watering the roses, my daughter called. Sarah's voice was bright and hurried, the way it always sounded when she was about to ask for something or deliver news she thought I needed. "Mom, I was thinking of driving up this weekend with the kids, just for a couple days. Michael has a conference, so it would just be us. Would that be okay?" I stood there with the hose dripping onto my shoes, the wooden wren heavy in my pocket, where I had started carrying it like a talisman. Part of me lit up at the thought of my grandchildren running through the house again. Another part, the part that had begun to count the hours between Frank's visits, felt a small, cold thread of dread. I hadn't told Sarah about the handyman who fixed my roof and stayed for soup and left eggs on my doorstep. I hadn't told her about the bench by the pond, or the lipstick, or the way my pulse still stumbled every time I heard his truck. "Of course," I said, my voice steady. "I'd love to see you all." We hung up, and I stood in the garden a long time, the evening light turning gold on the roses. I thought about inviting Frank for dinner before she arrived, just one more ordinary evening before the questions started. I thought about how the house would feel with children in it again, loud and alive, and I thought about the way his hand had felt around mine that first night, the steady warmth, the quiet promise of something I hadn't dared name. I dried my hands on my apron and walked inside. The blue mug and the wooden wren waited on the windowsill. I picked up the phone, dialed the number I now knew by heart, and waited for him to answer. When he did, his voice low and familiar, I heard myself say the words before I could second-guess them. "Would you like to come for dinner Friday night? Nothing fancy, just soup and bread again, if you're free." There was a pause, then that same quiet nod I could almost see through the phone. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." I hung up and stood in the kitchen with my heart beating too fast for a woman who had once believed her story was already written. Outside, the roses swayed in the evening breeze. Inside, the house felt different, warmer, fuller, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I didn't know yet what the weekend would bring, or how my daughter's visit would change the quiet rhythm we had begun to build, but for the first time in a very long time, I was willing to find out. The days leading up to Friday moved with a quiet, almost unbearable slowness. I cleaned the house twice, though it didn't need it, and changed my blouse 3 times before settling on the soft blue one that matched the mug on the windowsill. The wooden wren sat beside it like a small, silent chaperone. When Frank arrived at 6 with a bottle of apple cider from the farm stand, I felt that same low tremor start in my chest again, the one that had become familiar and frightening all at once. Dinner was simple, soup again, fresh bread, a salad from the garden. We ate at the kitchen table with the lamp on low, the way we had that first night. This time the conversation went deeper. He told me about the months after his wife died, how he had thrown himself into work so he wouldn't have to sit in the empty house and listen to the silence. I told him about the nights I had cried so hard in the shower that I couldn't tell the water from my tears, how I had learned to smile at the library patrons so no one would ask how I was really doing. He listened without trying to fix anything, the way only someone who had walked the same road could. When our bowls were empty, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. This time, he didn't let go right away. His thumb brushed the back of my knuckles once, slow and deliberate, and I felt the warmth travel up my arm and settle somewhere behind my ribs. We sat like that for a long minute, the only sound the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Later, on the porch swing he had helped me rehang the week before, we watched the fireflies come out. The night air was cool for June. I shivered without meaning to, and he slipped his arm around my shoulders, not pulling me close, just offering steady warmth. I leaned into it without thinking, my head resting against the solid line of his shoulder. The wooden wren was still in my pocket. I could feel its smooth shape through the fabric. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the house and the silence all by myself. He left at 10 with another of those quiet nods and a promise to check the mailbox hinge the next time he was by. I stood in the doorway long after his taillights faded, my shoulder still warm from where his arm had rested, my hand still remembering the weight of his. I went to bed that night with the blue mug on the nightstand and the wooden wren beside it, and for the first time since my husband died, I fell asleep without the usual ache pressing on my chest. Sarah arrived Saturday morning with the children in tow, Emma, 6, and little Michael, almost 4. The house filled with the sound of small feet and high voices and the constant motion of toys being unpacked and snacks requested. I laughed more in those first few hours than I had in months. Sarah hugged me tightly at the door, her eyes scanning the rooms the way she always did, looking for signs that I was managing. Everything seemed fine until late afternoon when Frank's truck pulled into the driveway. He had come to drop off the extra mulch he had promised for the rose beds. I saw Sarah's expression change the moment she spotted him through the window. She didn't say anything right away. She waited until the children were napping upstairs and we were alone in the kitchen with the blue mug between us on the table. Her voice was low, careful, the way people speak when they think they're protecting someone fragile. "Mom, who was that man?" "Frank Miller," I said, keeping my tone even. "He fixed the roof after the storm. He's been helping with a few things around the place." Sarah stirred her tea longer than necessary. "Helping, right. Mom, you're 51. You've been alone a long time, I get it. But men like that, they see a woman in a house like this, a widow with no one checking up on her, and they move in. I've seen it happen to friends of mine. They start with little repairs and end up with half your savings." The words landed like stones in still water. I felt something inside me go very still, the same way it had the day the doctor told me my husband's heart had stopped. This was my daughter, my only child, looking at me like I was the foolish one, like the careful life I had built was something she needed to rescue me from. Shame rose hot in my throat, followed quickly by a sharper, quieter anger I hadn't felt in years. "He's not like that," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "He lost his wife too. He understands what it's like to come home to an empty house. He's kind, that's all." Sarah set her spoon down. "Kind men still take things, Mom. I don't want to see you get hurt again. Dad's only been gone 3 years. People will talk. The neighbors already ask me how you're doing every time I'm in town. What do you think they'll say when they see his truck here every other day?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw the fear underneath the judgment. She wasn't angry at Frank. She was afraid of losing the version of me she had finally gotten back after the funeral, the version that was stable and predictable and didn't threaten to change the family story she had written in her head. The wound went deeper than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just that she disapproved. It was that her disapproval made me feel small and ridiculous for wanting something as simple as a warm hand on a cool evening. I didn't argue. I nodded and changed the subject to the children's school pictures. But that night, after they had gone to bed and Sarah was reading in the guest room, I sat alone in the kitchen with the blue mug in my hands and let the tears come. They weren't loud. They were the quiet kind that slip out when you realize the person who should understand you best has just told you that your happiness looks like a mistake. Sunday morning, Frank texted, just 3 words, "Hope the visit is good." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, about Sarah's words, about the shame that had settled in my chest like damp wood. Another part wanted to pull back, to protect the fragile thing we had begun to build before it could be torn apart by judgment I couldn't control. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked through the house, touching the places he had fixed: the cabinet door, the mailbox, the porch swing, and wondered if I had been a fool to let any of it happen. By the time Sarah and the children left that afternoon, the house felt too quiet again, but in a different way. The silence now carried the echo of her voice and the weight of my own doubt. I stood at the kitchen window, watching their car disappear down the road, the wooden wren heavy in my pocket. For the first time since that first night, I questioned whether the trembling I had felt was something I should have trusted or something I should have ignored. I picked up the phone anyway. Frank answered on the second ring, his voice low and steady the way it always was. I didn't tell him about the confrontation, not yet. I just asked if he wanted to come by for coffee the next evening, nothing more. He said yes without hesitation. When I hung up, I stood there with the phone still in my hand, the blue mug and the wooden wren watching from the windowsill, and realized the risk had never been about Frank at all. It had always been about whether I was brave enough to keep choosing the part of myself that had started to wake up, even when the people I loved most looked at that choice and called it foolish. If you've ever had your own child look at you like you're making a mistake with your heart, I would love to read your story in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest judgments come from the people who love us most, and learning to hold both their fear and your own truth at the same time is its own kind of trembling. The coffee shop on Main Street smelled like roasted beans and fresh cinnamon rolls, the same way it had for 20 years. I arrived early and chose the corner table by the window where the afternoon light came in soft and gold. Frank walked in 5 minutes later, still in his work flannel, but with the sleeves rolled up and his beard freshly trimmed. He carried 2 paper cups and set one in front of me without asking. Black, 1 sugar, the way I had started taking it since he first fixed my roof. We talked about nothing important at first: the price of lumber, the way the library had started a new book club that nobody was joining. Then the words I had been holding since Sunday came out in a rush. I told him about Sarah's visit, about the way her voice had tightened when she said "men like that," about the shame that had sat in my chest like wet wool ever since. I didn't cry, I just let the truth sit between us on the small wooden table, next to the wooden wren I had slipped into my pocket that morning without really knowing why. Frank listened the way he always did, quiet, steady, no rush to fill the silence. When I finished, he turned his cup slowly in his hands, the calluses on his thumbs catching the light. "I knew your husband a little," he said at last. His voice was low, almost rough. "Not well. We used to run into each other at the hardware store on Saturday mornings. He talked about you once, said you were the kind of woman who made an ordinary house feel like home even when the roof leaked and the bills piled up. I remembered that after he was gone, when the hospital sent that final statement, the one for the ambulance and the last tests, I paid it. Anonymous, through the foundation they have for people who can't. I didn't want you carrying that on top of everything else. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. I just couldn't stand the thought of you getting another bill in the mail with his name on it." The words landed slowly, like stones dropped one by one into still water. I stared at him across the table, the steam from my coffee rising between us. All this time I had thought he appeared out of nowhere that stormy afternoon, a kind stranger with rough hands and quiet eyes, but he had been there in the background for years, watching from a distance, carrying a piece of my grief I never knew existed. The least expected man had actually been the one who had been quietly present long before I ever needed him. Something inside me shifted, hard and clean. The shame Sarah's words had planted didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It wasn't foolishness I had been feeling. It was the first real hope I had allowed myself in 3 years, and it had scared me because it meant I was no longer the safe, predictable widow my daughter needed me to be. I reached across the table and covered Frank's hand with mine, the same way he had done that first night at my door. This time I didn't pull away. His fingers curled around mine, warm and steady, and for a long moment we just sat there, 2 people who had both learned the weight of empty houses and had somehow found each other anyway. When I got home that evening, the phone was ringing. Sarah again. Her voice was tighter this time, the careful politeness gone. "Mom, I talked to Mrs. Henderson at the post office. She said she's seen Frank Miller's truck at your house 3 times this week. What are you doing? I thought we talked about this." I stood in the kitchen with the blue mug in one hand and the wooden wren in the other, the light from the window falling across the counter in long golden stripes. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator, the same sounds that had once felt like the only company I would ever have again. "I'm living, Sarah," I said. My voice didn't shake. "I'm not 25 anymore. I buried your father, and I kept this house standing, and I smiled at every person who asked how I was doing, even when I wanted to crawl under the covers and never come out. Frank isn't using me. He sees me, the way your father saw me, the way I forgot I was allowed to be seen. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what I've chosen." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the children laughing in the background, the ordinary sound of a family that still had its center. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was smaller, the edge gone. "I'm scared, Mom. I don't want to lose you to someone else. I don't want to watch you get hurt again." "You won't lose me," I said, "but you might lose the version of me who stayed small and safe so you wouldn't have to worry. I'm not that woman anymore. I'm sorry if that's hard for you, but I'm not sorry for choosing this." We hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down and stood there for a long time, my heart beating hard but steady. The shame was still there, but it was smaller now, pushed to the edges by something stronger, clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop apologizing for wanting to be alive. Frank came by later that evening, uninvited, the way he sometimes did when he sensed the house needed something. He didn't ask what had happened, he just stepped inside, took the blue mug from my hands and set it on the counter. Then he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from my cheek, his rough thumb lingering for a second against my skin. The touch was so gentle it undid something I hadn't known was still knotted inside me. I closed my eyes and let myself lean into his palm, the way a person leans into sunlight after a long winter. "I told her," I whispered. "She doesn't understand yet, but I'm not going to stop seeing you because she's afraid." He didn't say anything right away. He just pulled me into the circle of his arms, not tight, just present, the solid warmth of a man who had carried his own losses and had learned not to run from someone else's. I rested my forehead against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart under the flannel. For the first time since that first night at the door, the trembling inside me felt less like fear and more like the ground settling after an earthquake. I was still standing, I was still choosing. When he left, I walked through the house touching the places that had changed, the fixed cabinet, the straightened mailbox, the porch swing that no longer creaked. The wooden wren sat on the windowsill beside the blue mug, both of them catching the last of the evening light. I picked up the little bird and held it in my palm the way Frank had that first time he showed me his carvings. It felt different now, not a reminder of loneliness, but a small carved promise that even the quietest men could carry more kindness than the world ever guessed. I didn't know yet what the next conversation with Sarah would bring, or how the small town would talk when they saw us walking together on Main Street, but I knew this much. The woman who had stood in the doorway that first night, shaking from a single hand squeeze, was gone. In her place was someone who had remembered how to want, how to risk, how to stand in her own kitchen and say out loud that she was no longer willing to live half alive just to keep everyone else comfortable. The house felt different that night, fuller somehow, even though I was alone. I made tea in the blue mug, set the wooden wren beside it, and sat at the table watching the darkness settle over the roses. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't press on my chest. It simply waited, patient and open, like the space beside me on the porch swing. I didn't know what would come next, but I was no longer afraid to find out. The weeks that followed brought changes so quiet they almost felt ordinary. Frank's toolbox now lived in the shed beside my husband's old one, not replacing it, but simply keeping it company. On Sunday mornings, we drank coffee on the porch swing while the roses opened in the early light, his arm around my shoulders and the wooden wren tucked safely in my pocket. I started wearing the soft rose lipstick every day, not for anyone else, but because I liked the way it made me feel when I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Lighter somehow, as if the years of careful emptiness had finally loosened their hold. Sarah called more often after that night. The conversations were still careful, still edged with the fear she couldn't quite name, but the sharpness had softened into something closer to concern. One evening she admitted, voice small, that watching me choose happiness had scared her because it meant the family story she had held onto so tightly was changing. I told her I understood. We didn't rush forgiveness. We simply kept talking, the way two women who love each other learn to do when the ground between them shifts. Inside me, something had settled into peace. The house no longer felt too big or too quiet. It felt lived in again, by laughter over simple dinners, by the steady sound of Frank humming while he fixed the loose hinge on the garden gate, by the knowledge that I was no longer invisible, even to myself. At 51, I had believed my story of love and possibility was already finished. I was wrong. The best chapters sometimes arrive with work boots on the mat and a hand that reaches for yours without asking for anything in return. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been surprised by love when you least expected it? And if these quiet stories of women finding their way back to themselves bring you any comfort, I would be grateful if you subscribed, so we can keep remembering together that none of us are ever truly finished.